Hello, I'm Ryan, and welcome to my channel Analyze This, Mr. Bond, where I discuss the adventures of super spy James Bond 007 and dig for what lies beneath the surface. Today we are taking a break from my series on the Roger Moore Bond films to discuss a subject that is near and dear to my heart, the Dynamite James Bond comics. I think these are a tragically under-discussed aspect of Bond fiction. I think they are phenomenally well crafted in many cases and offer an exciting and fresh version of Bond that every Bond fan should be able to experience. I think the biggest barrier to entry is knowing where to start. So, as I cover the what, why, and how of Bond comics, I'm going to lead with the how. Because if all you're going to watch is the first few minutes of this video, I want you to come away understanding how you can get into Bond comics. What's the starting point? Where should you look? There are a lot of Bond comics in the world. Where do you look to get hooked? And I have down in the description of this video a curated reading list. It's going to start off with the story arc that I think you should read if you're only going to read one. If you're just trying to experiment with it and see if these Bond comics are for you, I've got your one and done recommendation. But if you're willing to invest a little bit more time, I've got a slightly longer reading list of story arcs that I think fit together tightly and kind of tell a kind of sequential development in the story arcs that really showcases the best that these comics have to offer and really showcase what makes this particular version of Bond so compelling. So the Dynamite Bond comics kicked off with the story arc Vargr, authored by Warren Ellis. Warren Ellis was the author who really was tasked with reinventing Bond for the Dynamite comics. And he sat down and created a very contemporary version of James Bond. And this contemporary version of James Bond, in some ways, is pulling a bit from the harder edge of the Craig era. These comics, I don't want to softball this, are very much like the hard R equivalent of James Bond. They are very violent, they are very brutal, and they have a dark edge. But what is so lovely about the template Warren Ellis lays out in his first two story arcs, Vargr, and then he followed it up with Eidolon, and Eidolon is my favorite of the run altogether. It's where I actually recommend you start if you're only going to read one arc. Eidolon is so exciting and thrilling and tight, and you see Warren Ellis playing with some of the same ideas that the Craig era was exploring, but his Bond is a very different character than Daniel Craig's Bond. His Bond is not a character who is perpetually obsessed with his own trauma and is really struggling with his own identity. This is a character who is very comfortable being a blunt instrument. In fact, I would say Warren Ellis's Bond is a bad person. Is a very bad person, in fact. But he is a bad person who is sent after other bad people by the British government. And he is ruthless, he's arrogant, he's a little vain, but he is tremendously efficient, and he is smart. And this type of narratives that Warren Ellis establishes in that 1-2 punch of Vargr and Eidolon is a Bond who is enmeshed in a contemporary world with contemporary politics and just fits into it seamlessly. There's such a strong emphasis on spycraft, a smart, intelligent perspective on how technology is evolving, how political dynamics are shifting. One of the follow-up arcs that does so well with exploring some of the geopolitical dynamic shifts is a story arc called Kill Chain, which is actually about the return of Smersh, a very familiar foe for James Bond, and dealing with the complex geopolitics between Russia America of the past decade and Britain, and how they're not really getting along that well. What does it mean for NATO to exist in the midst of that? And what happens when you start to get some particularly bad actors destabilizing the global stage? It starts to deal with politics in a way that the Bond films never could. And in fact, that's what you find with these comics in general, is that the harder edge that they go for, the sort of political ideas they explore, are things that they could never really do in a Bond film. They'd just be too polarizing. But with the harder hitting edge of this character, it really emphasizes like the exciting part of spy stories for me. It really feels like it creates a landscape that's like a new Cold War in which the character makes perfect sense. And as dark as that landscape is, these comics have a really strong sense of fun. They know how to play with the formula really well. The elements are all present, you know, the romance, the locations, the gadgetry, Bond's sense of humor, his relationship with Felix Leiter. Felix Leiter in these comics is a wonderful, great addition. In fact, gets a story arc of his own that's kind of like a detective story of sorts, where Felix Leiter is in Japan. It's kind of like a remake of Black Rain, but it's built around the character of Felix Leiter. It's a really fun story arc that does some really clever things with that character and starts to enrich his world. And indeed, the characters that surround Bond in this world are nicely defined. They don't overtake these stories, but his relationship with M is very terse and tense, and M himself is kind of a darker figure here, a little bit more ruthless, a little bit more accepting that this job means getting his hands dirty and sending out people to do some fairly ugly actions in the interests of national security. And Moneypenny is more in line with the Moneypenny we see in the Craig era, but a little bit harder, a little bit darker. In one of the story arcs, you even find out that Moneypenny exists in some ways to be like a kill switch for M. So if M is ever captured, Moneypenny is tasked with the responsibility of actually executing him so that his secrets don't fall into enemy hands. It's a great little twist on the relationship, and there's the sense that death is just kind of an omnipresent factor in this world. But I think there's just also a lot of fun, colorful ideas that pop up here that Bond fans would love. In the story arc Kill Chain about the rise of Smersh, there's this whole big set piece with Bond attending an auction for a very expensive pocket watch. It's somewhat reminiscent of Octopussy and that sort of classic Bond vibes, but is embedded in this sort of brewing, tense geopolitical conflict that's very modern and very up to date with the sensibilities of our moment. In many ways, this Bond feels much more clued into the world of the last decade than the Daniel Craig Bond movies actually did. The Daniel Craig Bond movies felt a little bit more divorced from the real world in their concerns, whereas the comics really lean in there without abandoning the fantasy of Bond. The fantasy of Bond is in full effect here. I really like how much the gadgetry plays a role, how much the Bond tropes in many ways are celebrated, and it creates a nice tension between the hard edge and the sort of fantasy life of it. In some ways, the Bond of these stories, who is arrogant, vain, ruthless, is kind of like the gritty version of Roger Moore's Bond from his first two adventures, Live and Let Die and The Man with the Golden Gun. He's clever, he's sort of callous, but he's just also just like focused and assured, and, you know, there's something about watching a character who's just so arrogant and smug knock down other bad guys. It's just something we all love, and it's always been a facet of the cinematic Bond character to see that. That's one reason Connery's Bond, for all of his swagger, was so appealing to watch, was just this tough guy who was getting one over on a bunch of really bad people. And these stories really capture that dynamic in a good way, while also just letting Bond be a very dark spy. So the latest story arc, I think, is really cool. It hasn't completed yet, but I think it's very promising. The issue 1 just dropped. Writer Garth Ennis is doing a story arc called Your Cold, Cold Heart, about a super weapon that was developed ages ago, that's kind of like it instantly freezes water and then kind of dissolves, essentially creating this kind of like instant freeze super weapon that is now returning in the contemporary stage. And Bond is now talking to a retired 00 agent from decades back who dealt with the original situation surrounding the development of that super weapon by the British government. If that sounds a little bit familiar in terms of some of the tropes that were explored in the Craig era, it's there, but it's like embedded much more in this sense of the spy world, of spy history over the decades. And again, you kind of see a lot of the ideas that were explored in the Craig era get sort of revisited from different vantage points in these comics. Eidolon, my favorite of the arcs, is the one that really kind of is like, what if Spectre was a really focused movie in some ways? Like it's digging into actually this idea of the return of Spectre. What you find out in Eidolon is that Spectre, which was destroyed long ago in this continuity, has sort of like a leftover sort of cell that is reactivated. And what happens once that cell is reactivated kicks off like a chain reaction of events. And it's dealing with certain elements that show up in the movie Spectre, like M having to deal with another government official that's trying to kind of deprecate his work. So there's this kind of ongoing squabble between MI5 and MI6 about whether 00 agents can operate on British soil, or whether their authority to carry out their activities only extends outside of the shores of Britain. It's just really smartly done. And at the center of it is a version of James Bond that I can really get behind. I would go as far as to say, is with the story arcs that I'm going to lay out in the description as a recommended reading list, I would be perfectly happy with that run as sort of like an arc of stories that we could have had as like a movie era. I think it would have fit together perfectly well. I think it would have been very satisfying. In fact, it's exactly more or less where I'd love Bond to be when we get a Bond in Bond 26. Now, as noted, these comics are doing things that I don't think the movies would ever dare to do, especially in terms of how unlikable they're willing to make Bond on occasion. Those of you who have commented on my videos saying that you enjoy Bond to be, a really sort of unlikable guy at times, like, it definitely goes in that direction in more than one story. And it's definitely also aware of the ramifications of that. So it's not shying away from the complexities of the spy world in a way that I appreciate. It's kind of like, it's a world in which all morality is in kind of shades of gray, and everybody's playing a dirty game, and James Bond is an expert at playing it. I also just love how focused these stories tend to be because of the compressed time that these stories have to tell this compressed space they have to tell their stories, really, because it's space. They have to be very focused, and they have to be precise in how they structure their own episodes, so they feel, from a narrative perspective, a lot more clear and organized than a lot of recent blockbuster cinema in general. They are very much at their best, have a very clear sight of how a Bond story should progress. And I appreciate that, because as much as I enjoy the Craig era, and I've done my series on the Craig era, in many cases defending a lot of aspects of it, Bond plots are way overcomplicated these days. And what I appreciate about these comics is in some ways they return Bond narratives back to the focus that they had in the Ian Fleming years. The Ian Fleming Bond stories sometimes had their intricacies, but they were focused and clean in a way that is often not the case of Bond stories today, which has, multiple MacGuffins and characters that sort of drift in and out and subplots on top of subplots, and it just gets to be a mess. And I really appreciate how most of these comics just move forward relentlessly, like a really clean action movie. I'm being coy here because in many ways the joy of these comics is discovering them. I don't want to give the game away. When you're sitting here with a comic, and I have some of these comics in physical editions here, like you see here. This is the collection that collects the first two arcs of the series, the Warren Ellis Omnibus. So this has both Vargr and Eidolon. I have some of them in physical copies, but I read a lot of them digitally. You can read comics digitally now. I find it easier to keep up with them that way. But I like to own the most exciting of them in physical editions. They just feel like such exciting diversions. In many ways, I prefer the best of these stories to nearly all of the Bond continuation novels, and I know that's a big claim, but I think the best of these stories have a clarity of purpose and intent that is often not the case for the authors that came after Fleming. Even something as strong as the novel Colonel Sun, it has its places where it goes a little bit astray, and I love the Anthony Horowitz stories, to be sure, and have a lot of nostalgia for the books of Raymond Benson, but these comics have such a clear vision of who they want Bond to be in the context of these stories, and such a clear sense of like what Bond's world could be in the time period in which we live, that it's really thrilling to me. In many ways, these comics feel like what might have happened if Bond became either a slightly like an R-rated film series, or really maybe like what we would get if you got a really well-produced HBO series version of James Bond, just really hard-hitting and very clearly made for an adult audience, but with a sense of like pushing boundaries a little bit about what it would look like if they leaned into the darker corners of spy work. So I will essentially leave it there. I've made a pretty strong pitch. I will probably do some follow-up videos to this where I talk about the details of particular arcs, but I don't want to give the game away here. In many ways, I want this video to just be me desperately pleading with you all to read these comics, because I think the best of them are really good, and I think you'll really like them. And I think Bond fans, especially in this time period where we're waiting for Bond 26 to get going, could really do with the diversion that they offer. There's essentially an equivalent of like a handful, more than a handful of like essentially good Bond films here in terms of narrative content that I think folks would get a kick out of, and it's definitely going to be a fun ride if you dig into it. So I'll leave that here. I'll catch you in my next video where we'll pick back up with the Roger Moore era and The Spy Who Loved Me. But let me know in the comments if you have any questions about the comics. Obviously, read the description for my recommendations about where you should start with these, what sort of reading order you should follow. And as always, I'll catch you in the next one.